Lately, it feels like modern movies, especially genre movies, are obligated to be critical of their own premises. I've already made a video about this, but essentially, unless you're making a serious, gritty, grown-up deconstruction, you can't make a superhero movie or a spy movie or a space opera movie without glancing at the camera every so often and letting the audience know that you too think this entire concept is a little bit silly.
These guys come from legend, they're basically gods.
There's only one god, man. And I'm pretty sure he doesn't dress like that.
The most popular movies to come out in specific genres in the last 2 decades tend to be, on some level, parodies or send-ups or pastiches. And none of these are necessarily bad movies. There's nothing wrong with lampshading, and I wouldn't be a StarKid fan if I didn't love affectionate parody. But when it becomes so common that it feels like an obligation, like movies are no longer allowed to just play stuff straight, the self-awareness starts to feel shallow and wooden, like the screenwriters are just ticking off a box. But it makes sense why people do this. Audiences crave innovation, but they also want familiarity and stability. Something that's exactly the same as what they've seen before will bore them, but something that's too new and different can scare people away. This obligatory self-awareness allows movies to seem like they're being new and different by poking fun at old genre tropes while simultaneously giving the audience those same genre tropes they're making fun of. This also means that when they do something new and subversive, they have a means to draw attention to it, allowing them to milk as much value as possible out of the spots of genuine creativity. These innovations, however, are working against the premise rather than innovating within it. The subversiveness and novelty of these movies comes from their willingness to mock the tropes, conventions, and often the very core concepts of their parent genres. But there is one filmmaker whose work is firmly entrenched in the realm of genre, who consistently avoids this crutch. A filmmaker who earnestly delivers celebrations and explorations and continuations of old, outdated, and forgotten storytelling conventions. A filmmaker who's never quite worked in the same genre twice, but whose wholesale commitment to his premises makes his aesthetic touch instantly recognizable. Let's talk about Guillermo del Toro. Del Toro has proven time and time again that you can find depth and innovation within a premise without working against it. He makes movies that exist comfortably and uncritically within the confines of a genre and yet still manage to redefine it. Just because Del Toro is not working against his own premise doesn't mean his movies aren't innovative or interesting. He simply presents his innovations without feeling the need to metatextually compare them to the source that they deviate from. And because he does not allow himself the crutch of constant lampshading and postmodern cynicism, genuine creativity is the only avenue he has to hold his audience's attention. I want to mainly focus on 3 movies of his that are unapologetic celebrations of very specific genres. Pacific Rim, a mecha kaiju movie, The Shape of Water, a Cold War-era monster movie, and Crimson Peak, a Gothic romance. Before I continue, I would suggest watching all 3 of these movies if you haven't seen them already. They're all beautiful, and I'm about to spoil the hell out of all of them. Pacific Rim is a movie about people piloting giant robots to defeat enormous interdimensional monsters with the power of love, and enormous plasma cannons, but mostly love. The movie is based on both humongous mecha anime like Gundam or Voltron, and kaiju movies like Godzilla and Rodan. The base concept itself of humongous mecha fighting skyscraper-sized monsters is ridiculous enough, but the movie adds an extra layer to all of it with the conceit that the successful piloting of a Jaeger requires a harmonious emotional bond between 2 people. The more in sync a pair of Jaeger pilots are, the better they fight. The fate of humanity relies on the power of friendship. And yet this entire ludicrous concept is played unabashedly straight. Everyone takes this world of monsters and giant robots deadly seriously. There's certainly moments of levity and humor, but the concept of the movie is never mocked. This is a serious entry into a genre rather than a pastiche of it. Of the 3 pictures we're looking at, The Shape of Water has the clearest, most specific inspiration. While it is a love letter to the genre of 50s monster movies, it mainly acts as one to a specific movie, The Creature from the Black Lagoon. The Creature from the Black Lagoon tells the story of a team of researchers who stumble upon a prehistoric amphibious humanoid in the Amazon River and attempt to capture it. The Shape of Water tells the story of a similar amphibious creature that was captured in the Amazon and is being kept in a government facility, and the human woman with whom it falls in love. But while one movie is a horror and the other is a romance, Guillermo isn't criticizing The Creature from the Black Lagoon for the way it portrayed its monster. The pathos and humanity that Guillermo's Fishman possesses was something that he saw in the original creature. The original Gillman was not vilified, it was treated as an innocent caught in unfortunate circumstances, both as an animal understandably reacting to alien threats, and as a human being desiring companionship. The creature's death in Black Lagoon is not treated as a triumph, but an unfortunately necessary action taken by the protagonist to survive.
No.
The circumstances of the film's climax are framed as a tragedy. Guillermo is simply expanding the concept in a way that would have been impossible under the decency laws of the 1950s. There's the same creature, the same overzealous hunter who wants it captured or dead, and the same human characters who view it with sympathy. The characters, the setting, and the moral center are largely unaltered, and they are not presented in a mocking or tongue-in-cheek way. Guillermo is just asking, with sincere earnestness, if it would be possible for things to work out differently. In both movies, harming this creature is presented as wrong. The Shape of Water simply gives its characters the opportunity to prevent that wrongdoing.
This is just... oh God, it's not even human.
But while the pathos was there in Black Lagoon, the mutual attraction between human and monster was not. While the setting and circumstances of The Shape of Water places it firmly in the genre of horror fantasy, its story puts it into that of romance, and Guillermo approaches this genre with the same uncynical earnestness that he approaches every other. The Shape of Water is a very divisive movie. People either really, really love it or despise it with a passion. But which camp people fall into depends, in my experience, on whether they had already bought into the premise going in. The biggest complaint from its detractors had nothing to do with the actual quality of the filmmaking or performances or production design. The people who hate it are angry that a movie advertised as a love story between a human woman and a fishman turned out to actually be a love story between a human woman and a fishman. Guillermo del Toro doesn't give you any reassuring winks towards the fourth wall. There's no tongue-in-cheek quips to assure you that this is all a joke and he's in on it. It wasn't just the concept that turned some people off, otherwise they likely wouldn't have bothered to see it at all, but the earnestness with which that concept was presented. This is a movie about a woman loving a monster, but instead of being presented ironically or as something shocking or horrifying, the relationship is played entirely straight. This is a love story, with a dance sequence and a sex scene and a happy ending, fully committed to the genre of romance, possibly the most commonly mocked genre of all. To quote the man himself, "Optimism is radical. It is the hard choice, the brave choice, and it is, it seems to me, most needed now, in the face of despair, just as a car is most useful when you have a distance to close, otherwise it is a large unmovable object parked in the garage. These days, the safest way for someone to appear intelligent is being skeptical by default. We seem sophisticated when we say we don't believe, and disingenuous when we say we do. History and fable have both proven that nothing is ever entirely lost. David can take Goliath, a beach in Normandy can turn the tide of a war, bravery can topple the powerful. These facts are often seen as exceptional, but they are not. Every day we all become the balance of our own choices. Choices between love and fear, belief or despair. No hope is ever too small. Optimism is our instinct to inhale while suffocating, our need to declare what needs to be in the face of what is. Optimism is not uncool, it is rebellious and daring and vital. Guillermo expects you to check your suspension of disbelief at the door and leave it there. Not everyone can do that, but if you can, the absence of constant lampshading and total commitment to the admittedly bonkers concept is really refreshing. This is a really beautiful movie, but you won't be able to appreciate it if you don't let yourself. Crimson Peak's influences are more varied. Visually, it draws a lot of influence from the Italian giallo horror movies of the 1970s, with its unmotivated colored lights and frequent use of cookies, but its narrative is rooted in a slightly older storytelling tradition. If one had to ascribe a genre to it, it would be Gothic, but of course that word has more meanings than it has letters, so it would be best to take a look at some of the picture's specific influences. At first glance, there are many parallels in its tone and setting to The Fall of the House of Usher, a short story by Edgar Allan Poe that finds itself in the genre of Gothic horror. There's an old decrepit mansion that seems to be on the verge of collapse, who seems to respond empathetically to the condition of its inhabitants.
What was that?
That's the east wind. When it picks up, the chimneys form a vacuum, and with the windows all shuttered up, the house breathes.
The house is home to two siblings who have an inappropriately close relationship. The conditions within this house and its implicitly sentient nature seem to be slowly stagnating and killing the brother, but he refuses to leave it, eventually dying in the house along with his sister. The spookier elements find their roots firmly in the Gothic horror of Poe, but the story's more humanist themes are deeply entrenched in the Gothic romance of Charlotte Bronte. There are multiple plot and thematic parallels to Jane Eyre, the most overt being the secret marriage of the heroine's love interest. In the novel, the titular Jane is living at Thornfield Hall, working as a tutor for Mr. Rochester, a man who she is developing romantic feelings for. During her stay at Thornfield, she repeatedly encounters phenomena that seems to imply that the house is haunted. Eventually, she and Rochester realize their feelings for each other and become engaged. On the day of the wedding, a lawyer objects to the ceremony, revealing that Mr. Rochester cannot marry Jane as he is already married. When he was young, Rochester married one Bertha Mason so that his family could get its hands on her family's fortune. Mason went mad, and Rochester had her locked away in the attic of Thornfield Hall. The ghost that Jane was seeing was her love interest's first wife.
You didn't tell me it was a ghost story.
Oh, it's not. It's more story with the ghost in it. Mm-hmm. The ghost is just a metaphor.
A metaphor?
For the past.
Crimson Peak's ghosts are real, but Bronte's Madwoman in the Attic and Del Toro's translucent skeleton serve the same narrative and thematic purpose. The ghosts are not the antagonists of either work, although their conduct is often less than cordial. They're there to warn the protagonist about the real danger that lies in the secrets of the man that they are marrying. The storyline also has several parallels to the 1938 novel Rebecca. This novel follows a naive American heroine who marries a wealthy English aristocrat and moves into his mansion in Cornwall. The mansion is filled with the memories of her husband's first wife, remembered by everyone as a perfect paragon of womanly virtue, who died in a mysterious boating accident. The mansion's housekeeper feels that the heroine is trying to replace the beloved late Mrs. De Winter and tries to psychologically torture her into suicide. The heroine comes to fear that her husband never loved her and only truly has feelings for his dead wife. It eventually comes to light that the previous Mrs. De Winter was a controlling manipulator who Mr. De Winter murdered in a fit of rage after finding out about an affair she'd had and the resulting pregnancy. The heroine is happy to find out that her husband, in spite of his murderous past and the secrets he kept from her, really does love her after all.
You lied to me!
I did.
You poisoned me! You told me you loved me!
I do.
There are fewer direct parallels here, but there are multiple shared narrative tropes and relationship dynamics. The mysterious suitor, the heroine's fear that her husband doesn't love her, the female character that makes the heroine feel unwelcome in her new home, the controlling, manipulative relationship between the love interest and the heroine's romantic rival, the revelations of murder, and the sympathetic light in which the love interest is cast despite him doing a lot of horrible things. I don't know if Guillermo del Toro read either of these books. I do suspect he's familiar with the former, given that his heroine also played Jane Eyre in a 2011 adaptation, but he certainly read books or watched movies that were influenced by them. The old crumbling manor house that acts both as a backdrop and a character, the mysterious aristocratic love interest, the romantic rival, the psychological manipulation and gaslighting, the protagonist being trapped in a place with no allies to turn to for help and only her wits to navigate a dangerous game of etiquette, social graces, and murder, these are all the standard tropes of a Gothic novel, and while Del Toro certainly puts his own signature spin on them, adding more overt supernatural elements and on-screen action, he is innovating within the genre rather than making a pastiche of it. The tropes of Gothic novels are played gloriously and unapologetically straight. Del Toro's movies tend to operate on a very stark black and white morality. There is rarely any question about who the good guys and bad guys are. Antagonists tend to wear their villainy on their sleeves. The morality of Pacific Rim is the most clearly black and white, as its villains are inhuman monsters whose only goal is to destroy humanity. But one should not assume that this starkness indicates a lack of character depth. Because the villains are so clearly defined, everyone who is not a city-destroying rage monster is a hero by default. All of the major human characters are in the business of saving the world, and the villains are in the business of destroying it, so there's less of a need to make sure the heroes are differentiated. Because the villains are placed so firmly in the camp of inhuman evil, Guillermo has a lot more leeway when it comes to writing his heroes. The human characters run the gamut from deeply damaged to arrogant and antagonistic, and they spend the movie squabbling, bullying, and generally getting on each other's nerves. But because the threat they are facing is so great, Del Toro can explore these extremes without the audience getting confused about whose side we're supposed to be on. This is largely a movie about people learning to work together and get along with each other, and because the lines between good and evil are so firmly drawn, Del Toro is free to explore and resolve these antagonistic character dynamics. Raleigh and Chuck develop an immature rivalry. Mako and Stacker are at odds over her desire to be a pilot and his desire to keep her safe, but I personally think the most interesting character dynamic is the one between Newt and Herman. These two scientists are both trying to find a way to stop the Kaiju, and neither has any respect for the other's theories. Professional rivalries are certainly not a new subject, but movies about them tend to demonize one or both of the parties involved. But given the stakes involved in their research, both of these men have decent justifications for distrusting each other's theories, and for the intensity with which that distrust manifests. The Kaiju allow Newt and Herman's mutual dislike to be intense and petty without either of them being unlikable, which makes their eventual reconciliation all the more powerful.
We're gonna own this bad boy! By Jove, we are going to own this thing for sure!
By making the villains of the movie so inhuman and evil, Guillermo is able to cast his heroes' personalities in wider shades of gray and more deeply explore their personal issues without losing his trademark optimism. Guillermo del Toro's non-monstrous antagonists are intense and wonderful and so undeniably human. Complex villains are not a new idea. Giving an antagonist pathos and relatable motivations is a tried and true method of adding depth to your story. Usually, this results in the villains being sympathetic. Because we understand them as people, we understand where they're coming from, which means we may start to at least consider taking their side. If this guy can elicit pathos, maybe he's not such a bad guy after all. But Del Toro's approach to multifaceted villainy is a little different. Because he writes villains that are complex and interesting and human. Their motivations are clear, their desires and fears and dreams are understandable and relatable, and yet they are still 100% unambiguously evil. The morality of his movies is always completely black and white. There's very little question over what the right thing to do is, only whether our protagonist will have the strength to do it. In The Shape of Water, I understood Strickland. Every decision he made sense, given what we knew about him. He wasn't just an exaggerated racist caricature or one-dimensional psychopath. He was a real person and a person who I understood and on some level felt for. He had clear motivation for what he was doing. He had a personal moral code and genuinely thought he was in the right. And yet I was very happy to watch him die.
Fuck. You are a god.
Because despite being a person, he was still an irredeemable asshole. Sometimes Del Toro's villains are giant monsters or supernatural robots, but more often than not they're people, and the humanity that Del Toro infuses them with is not an attempt to excuse their actions. It instead acts to peel back the curtain of sexy mystique that is so often draped around those who commit atrocities. Behind all of his posturing, Strickland is pathetically human. His motivations, while consistent and understandable, are disappointingly mundane. He is essentially doing all of these horrible things for his career. In his 1963 book Eichmann in Jerusalem, A Report on the Banality of Evil, Hannah Arendt wrote this of Adolf Eichmann. The trouble with Eichmann was precisely that so many were like him, and that the many were neither perverted nor sadistic, that they were, and still are, terribly and terrifyingly normal. From the viewpoint of our legal institutions and of our moral standards of judgment, this normality was much more terrifying than all of the atrocities put together. Eichmann was not Iago and not Macbeth, and nothing would have been further from his mind than to determine with Richard III to prove a villain. Except for an extraordinary diligence in looking out for his personal advancement, he had no motives at all. He merely, to put the matter colloquially, never realized what he was doing. It was sheer thoughtlessness, something by no means identical with stupidity, that predisposed him to become one of the greatest criminals of that period. Del Toro isn't interested in moral ambiguities or shades of gray. Unambiguously evil people do exist, but they aren't cartoonish supervillains. That they do what they do in spite of their humanity, and the single-minded simplicity of their motivations is what makes them terrifying. Crimson Peak is more concerned with the psychologies of its individual characters and their immediate personal relationships with each other than their place in society and their complicitness in enforcing its nastier elements. While The Shape of Water's themes were built around social acceptance and deviancy, and as such its villain was motivated by the unquestioning desire to climb the social ladder and root out social degeneracy, Crimson Peak is concerned with people's relationship with their past, and its villains are fueled by an obsession with preserving the status quo of their lives, cursed with an inability to let go and move on. Lucille commits every horrible crime for the sake of love, motivated by her desire to hold on to the life she has with her brother.
For what? The money? To keep the mansion? The sharp name? The mines?
The marriages were for money, of course. But the horror was for love.
She's tortured watching Thomas start to fall for someone else. She's controlling him and stifling him and eventually murders him, but he really is all she has in the world, and knowing what we know about her, her actions make sense. These aren't the random outbursts of an unhinged crazy lady. Everything she does is a means to an emotional end. But it is not despite her humanity, but simply parallel to it, that she is clearly, inarguably, and unambiguously evil. It's easy to not take things seriously. If you never fully invest in something, if you remain cool and detached from your work, then no one can mock you for it.
Listen well, brother.
I'm listening.
The constant self-referential quipping is like the artistic equivalent of making fun of yourself before your bullies get a chance to, so now you're in on the joke and no one can make fun of you. But while this approach provides a layer of insulation from the potential lambastments of critics and audiences, that armor can also act as a barrier. Closing yourself off to people who might potentially mock your ideas also means closing yourself off to people who might really like them. which means there's an upper limit on how deeply people can engage with what you make. Movies like this can certainly be entertaining, but I think that their own attitude towards themselves keeps people from really getting into them on a deeper personal level. I really love genre. I love superheroes and science fiction and sentimental pastoral romance. I want movies that I can really get excited about, which is why I'd really like to see more filmmakers approach genre the way Del Toro does. Because if a filmmaker doesn't fully embrace their concept and take their premise seriously, how can they expect anyone else to?